People ask me all the time what my favorite book is of all time. And for most historians, it's usually a pretty tough question. I've got a bunch of things that I really love. Spanish Frontier in North America is among them. Mosquito Empires by J.R. McNeil is definitely one of them. And you should know how much I love Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast. But if I had to be pressed on any single book, it's going to come back to Homer and Odysseus and the Odyssey. And I suppose that shouldn't be a surprise. Like a lot of people, I got into history because of my love of the classics. I remember how much I loved reading about Alexander the Great and his conquest of the world and all of the great mythological characters and people that you might find in Greece. And Odysseus always seemed to resonate with me. You've heard me talk earlier on the podcast about my thoughts about Bruce Willis as some version of Odysseus in Die Hard. And I certainly think about the movie Troy and Sean Bean as Odysseus. But my favorite version of Odysseus is George Clooney, fellow Kentuckian, in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? You know, this movie is a Coen Brothers movie, but I tend not to think about it as a Coen Brothers movie. It feels like something else entirely. But I've always loved it. The soundtrack's amazing. I love its depictions of the Depression-era South. Love the acting. Love how much this movie makes me laugh. And I was looking to talk about this movie with somebody. And friend of the podcast, Brett Rushforth, recommended Christopher Hodson, who he is known for a long time. And Chris and I got to talking. And we almost talked about RoboCop. RoboCop is one I still want to get on here. But we have ultimately settled on Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? We've got a love of the South. Chris has actually done a lot of work on the South, but comes at it from a different angle. He's actually a historian of New France and of French history. And ended up writing this amazing book called The Acadian Diaspora. You guys know that I grew up in Louisiana, so I actually turned to this book immediately. But he does so many other different things. He's actually a professor at BYU. He wrote this book, The Acadian Diaspora, an 18th-century history. He's written a bunch of stuff in the William and Mary Quarterly, French Historical Studies, Early American Studies. And he's writing a new book now with Brett, actually, about the intertwined histories of France, West Africa, and the Americas from the medieval period all the way up to the Age of Revolutions. So he does an incredible amount of stuff. He's out there at BYU. He's a couple years older than me, but apparently has, actually done other things with his life. So that's always impressive to find someone who is far more talented than me. Yeah, I'm going to get depressed right now. But I do want to introduce you guys to Chris. We had an awesome discussion today about Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, the Coen Brothers, why No Country for Old Men is too terrifying to watch ever again, and whether or not we love Fop or Dapper Dan. So sit back and relax, because Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Is next on the Historians of the Movies podcast. All right, Chris Hodson, what's going on, man? How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
I feel totally fake. As you know, we were just part of a conversation in which we were going to introduce this podcast, and now we're actually going through the pod. I never know how to start these things. They've always felt...
Yeah, we live in a simulation. It's fine.
Yeah, it's the Matrix, right?
For sure.
Which we could have done, but we did Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Which is... Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Could have probably used some more fighting, some more kung fu.
Oh,
at
definitely.
Some point in time.
Yeah. All movies need more fighting, more gratuitous violence. That's absolutely the case.
Did you see the news about Lance Reddick from John Wick recently?
Oh, I think he died just recently?
Died.
Yes.
Yeah, he died. Apparently natural causes. He just didn't live anymore. So, and then I see all these stories, like everything that shows up is like Keanu Reeves is the best human alive, who would showed up on his own birthday to go give him a note telling him how great he is. I'm just like, is Keanu Reeves maybe the male equivalent to Dolly Parton? Do we deserve a world in which we get to live where Keanu Reeves does?
Yeah, he is a little bit like that, I think. There's all sorts of all over the internet. There's just various encounters with Keanu Reeves, and he sort of manages to be like the platonic ideal of, sort of good man at all times. So yes, I myself do not deserve to live on a planet with Keanu Reeves, I don't think.
No, none of us do. All right, I have a standard question. I don't know that I told you about this before. This goes back to a long-standing Twitter fight, which is: are you team Coca-Cola or team Pepsi?
Coke. That's not really a question.
No,
I'm not a juvenile delinquent. I'm not a snowboarder. I don't drink Pepsi. I drink Coke like a normal person.
Outstanding. Thank you very much for saying that. There's one person in particular who needs to hear it. She'll hear it eventually, I promise you. Hi, Heather. Anyway, tell us a little bit about your work. You're at BYU, is that correct?
That's right. I've been at BYU for 16 years now, since 2007.
Oh my gosh, what are you doing out there? Like as work?
As work, yeah. So, I'm a historian who's ostensibly an early Americanist, although I'm kind of like the fakest American historian of all time.
I got you beat there, but go on.
Yeah. So I started, when I entered graduate school, my PhD program, I did my undergrad at Utah State. I'm from Utah. I did my bachelor's degree and a master's degree in history at Utah State. And I did a PhD at Northwestern a long time ago. And I actually entered graduate school intending to become just a pretty straightforward French historian. I was really, really interested in early modern France, spent a lot of time in France as a younger person, so had the language and so on and so forth. But when I was in graduate school, I got really, really interested in kind of Atlantic and colonial questions and that historiography and that set of debates and so on. And so wound up kind of flipping teams after my first year of graduate school. And so since then, I've been working primarily as a kind of French Atlantic historian. So I'm really interested in French relationships with West Africa, with North America, with the Caribbean, and their indigenous peoples. And that's basically what I've been up to. I wrote a first book a long time ago about Acadians, which I hope we'll maybe chat about a little bit. Still something I'm really interested in and get to revisit every once in a while, which is really, really fun. And then, as you know, Jason, one of your previous guests, Brett Rushforth, who's at the University of Oregon, he and I are longtime friends. And we just completed a book manuscript that's sort of a big history of France and Africa and the Americas from the medieval period up through the 19th century.
So I thought we had agreed not to mention Brett by name. Now I've done it, so I guess we've ruined the entire podcast.
You can just bleep it out.
He who shall not be named. Yeah, right. So if you're listening, Brett's like the best human alive. So, so there's that. I have to tell you about your book. My first encounter with your book, which was that, as a historian, I think we all gravitate towards really cool book titles and prints and so forth. And with my own background, I remember the first time I came across it, seeing the Acadian Diaspora, I was like, what is this? Because I had farted around with the idea growing up in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, about maybe one day, returning. I'm from Kentucky originally, but we moved down to Louisiana when I was 3. So Jason Herbert very quickly became Jason Hebert, almost immediately. People refused to even acknowledge my English ancestry, the first R in my name. They were like, no, you're one of us. You're Cajun. You probably know this term coon-ass as well, which got applied to me very quickly. And then I always end up having to explain to folks what that word is outside of Acadiana. But I wonder if maybe before we jump into this movie, you could talk a little bit about what the hell the Acadian Diaspora is.
Yeah, for sure. So I should say a lot of us as historians, and I fall into this category, I'm an aficionado of kind of project origin stories. Mm-hmm. And my project origin story is the dumbest one I've ever heard.
Outstanding.
So in effect, what happened was that when I was in my first year in my PhD program, like I say, was intending to be a French historian pretty straightforwardly, was doing a minor field in kind of colonial America, Atlantic history. And the early Americanist at Northwestern, who's a guy I'm sure you know, named Tim Breen, I was working with him on this minor field. We became friends. And he pulled me aside in the hall one day and just said, hey, I've got to tell you, if I was in your position and had your language and your kind of archival skill set, I'd really think hard about doing a dissertation on the Acadians and the expulsion of 1755. I think that could be really something good for you. It could be a real career maker. And I should not have been admitted to this grad program. I was not smart. I was 24. I didn't know what I was doing. And so I did my best, stroke my sort of beard and say, oh, yes, the Acadians and whatever. And then kind of scurried to the nearest computer and did whatever Googling was to make sure totally sure I knew what Acadians were, because I thought I knew.
Were you on Encarta? Was that what that was?
Yeah, right. And it turned out I was mostly right, but only mostly, And so I got really interested in Acadian history from that initial kind of set of conversations and a few first books that I read, a document collection, so on and so forth. And initially, anyway, I think Tim and probably me too, I thought of it much more as probably like a Britishy project. I was interested in the expulsion of the Acadians from the Canadian Maritimes in 1755, which is this really important and horrifying event that takes place, which triggers the Acadian diaspora, the scattering of Acadian peoples all over the Atlantic world. Luckily, I didn't sort of follow through with that because other people wrote that book way better than I would have. Jeff Plank, who's a terrific historian, wrote a really nice book about that. John McFarriger wrote a really good book about the expulsion itself. But I became interested really, really fast, basically, and there's no kind of cool or intellectual way of saying this, but I just became interested in all the wacky places that Acadians turned up. So they just start showing up after the expulsion in 1755, when about 15,000 of these people get exiled kind of all over the place. They start showing up in all these cities in British North America. They show up in the French Caribbean, in Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, and Guyana on the coast of South America. They show up in the Falkland Islands. They show up in France itself. They show up in England. And so I just became really, really interested in, what the process of becoming an 18th century exile or refugee would have done to a person or a community, and B, kind of what you could tell about the world of the 18th century Atlantic by following those refugee peoples around. And so that's kind of the initial sort of moment of origin of that, that project, which was my dissertation, which ultimately became that first book.
I grew up down, I'm going to focus in on that one small port down in Louisiana because, growing up down there, it seems so, well, golly, it doesn't seem like Cajuns exist anywhere else, but maybe they do. I don't know. If their story is similar in any of these other places that they land, is that the case? I mean, what happens to these other folks? Because Cajun, these folks end up in Louisiana. They develop this amazing culture, very centrally tied, to the Delta. Are there quasi-Cajuns elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. So quasi-Cajuns. I like that. That would be a really good book title too, actually. So basically what happens is that by the time we get to the mid-18th century, there's about 15,000 or so Acadians living in and around the Canadian Maritimes. So Acadians, of course, are people who are descendants of the original French colonists of that region from way back in the 17th century. The French colony of Acadie, of course, it becomes British Nova Scotia in 1713. So they're in this weird position where they're, in effect, French people living under a British regime and so on. And that's what triggers the expulsion, which is a long and interesting story in and of itself. So for one thing, there are Acadians who take refuge in and manage to return to the Canadian Maritimes after 1755 and after 1763, when the 7 Years' War ends. Mm-hmm. So there's a big and vibrant and interesting and really super cool, actually, Acadian community that's really centered in places like Moncton, New Brunswick, which is a great center of Acadian life. And there's a few other places in the Maritimes where that's the case. And I just love going to those places, just tons of cool people. All the archives that I went to and the people I interacted with who were scholars out there just were super welcoming to this kind of Yahoo kid from Utah who seemed to just kind of wander in and want to be involved in their historical life and so forth. So I just have great associations with them. It's also true, though, that there are Acadians who break off from kind of the main communities associated with the diaspora that then gather first in the Canadian Maritimes and then later on in the mid-1760s and then again a big migration in the 1780s in Louisiana. And so there are Acadians who remain in places like Saint-Domingue/Haiti into the 1790s. There are Acadians who remain in Guyana into the 1790s. There are Acadians who remain in France and keep reminding people that they're Acadians deep into the 19th century. So there are these kind of little funny offshoots of those two main communities that come out of the diaspora that you can kind of trace in some interesting ways in some really interesting places.
I'm trying to figure out a way to segue into the film itself. So I'm going to just focus on the wackiness of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Because when I reached out to you initially, I was like, hey, what film do you want to do? Do you want to do something, And you were like, we kind of settled in fairly quickly on this movie in particular. So I was kind of wondering, why Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? What draws you in? Why are we talking about this movie versus, say, something else?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not sure I have an especially good answer. And I'm not sure I want to expose all the listeners to the, effluvia of my psychology when it comes to those kinds of decisions and stuff. But I love Coen Brothers movies. Yeah. The Coen Brothers are incredible. I've kind of grown up with the Coen Brothers. My first exposure is Raising Arizona.
Yeah.
I'm born in 1975, so Raising Arizona is like a seminal, important movie from my kind of childhood and so forth. And Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? I have many, many good associations with Oh Brother, Where Art Thou as a Coen Brothers movie. It came out, I think, in 1999 or 2000. Does that sound right?
I want to say 2000.
So I remember it coming out during like my first or second year in graduate school. And, I don't know how it was for you or for, other people who were listening and so forth, but I found graduate school to be tremendously stress-inducing.
Yes.
Really exhausting. My wife and I had our first child in 2001. I mean, there was a lot of things going on. And Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Which I don't think I saw it in a theater. I think I had to wind up renting because I was too poor. But it just provided a sense of silliness on the one hand. Like it falls into that kind of Coen Brothers movie category with Raising Arizona and Big Lebowski that is just kind of fun and goofy and in some respects kind of mindless. But at the same time, I really think, and I know we're going to get to this, I think it's a deeply history movie on many, many levels. I think it's an incredible, now that I kind of rewatch it, it's an incredible reflection of that particular moment in time when it was produced, the late 1990s kind of turn of the millennium moment. And I think it's a great movie for historians to think about in that it is a riff on this original primary source, Homer's Odyssey, that the Coen brothers kind of take and just manipulate and move around and reject things and change things and really do something just profoundly interesting with, I think. So I love the Coen brothers. This movie is a source of kind of endless entertainment and good feelings for me. So that's one of the reasons why I chose it.
Yeah, I find that this is, there's a podcast out there called The Rewatchables. Bill Simmons does this thing where, talks about, these movies that are endlessly rewatchable. And I've always found that if this show is on, I know that there's a scene coming up pretty soon. John Goodman's going to make his appearance at some point in time, or, they're about to get RUNFOFT. There's always these spots. And of course, as a historian, as a Southerner, I feel like this thing has so much, there's this interesting thing that kind of comes out. This movie kind of stands in opposite of Gladiator in some ways. It comes out almost the exact same time, but you just mentioned, this is a retelling of the Odyssey. Gladiator, obviously taking place in ancient Rome. So there seems to be this fascination at the short time with, with these more ancient histories. At least a little bit, although the way that they're coming at this is zany and silly. And I don't know, what the thoughts were let's take the Odyssey and let's set it in the Depression era South. Stroke of genius.
It is a stroke of genius. And I remember reading about, and I kind of poked around a little bit in preparation for this podcast. And I remember reading that the Coen brothers it's a riff on this, on Homer's Odyssey, of course, but it's also a riff on this book called Sullivan's Travels, which is basically a book about a kind of well-meaning liberalish filmmaker who wants to make a film about real people during the Great Depression in the South. And he winds up becoming a real person because I think he gets robbed and stuff. Winds up walking more than a mile in the shoes of some of these folks and so on. And so I love to think in those terms too, like who had the idea of doing a slapstick version of Homer's Odyssey in the Depression South? And one of the reasons why I like this movie, and it kind of speaks to your kind of comment about the South being it's not just a location. The South it's fundamental to the movie. It's a character.
It's an absolute character. Sure, absolutely.
And one of the things I like about this movie, and I don't know that I could have articulated this when I first saw it, because again, I was not especially bright when I entered graduate school, which is when this came out, but I grew up in the American West, right? So I grew up in a place called Logan, Utah, which is in northern Utah. Have you seen the movie Napoleon Dynamite?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
If you have, that's where I'm from. I'm from the Utah side of the valley where that movie takes place. So that's the high culture background. And one of the kind of funny things about growing up in the rural West is that, and again, I couldn't have articulated this, but you got the sense that history had sort of deposited these layers of culture and people. And of course, when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, you're just a kid in the 80s and 90s, and you're doing the same thing everybody else is doing. You're playing baseball, you're going to the mall, whatever. But every once in a while, like old, weird Utah would pop back up, like stuff from the 19th century, like people from the 19th century, folk beliefs from the 19th century. You just see them every once in a while, and then they'd go back under. And that's one of the things I really love about Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, is that it's this kind of exploration of a moment in which things are ostensibly changing. You know, George Clooney's got this great line where he says, we're going to have a veritable age of reason, just like the one they had in France. But at the same time, continuity is always kind of pulling on these guys, and the old kind of mysterious folk ways keep kind of popping up. So I think in a weird way, the South in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou sort of stood in for the West as I had lived it when I first saw the movie.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing, you being from the West and I am from the South. And these places seem to have their own regional character. It's interesting. For me, I grew up in the South, so a lot of this stuff I really connected to because there was this intimate familiarity with not only just being from the South or the way that the South looks, but also the ways in which people would talk about the South. Because being from the South, especially say being from a place like Kentucky, you're kind of used to being the butt of a lot of jokes from outside, and you just kind of take those and rub them off. And of course, I make tons of jokes about the South because I'm like, oh, of course I can make those, but you can't make them,
Right.
And you kind of talked about this a little bit in terms of your own scholarship, because you kind of come to your scholarship and then also say this focus of this film from an area outside. There's like coming into it. Does the West have its own like kind of character? If you're going to kind of characterize, if you take Oh Brother, We're Out There and you set it out West, what happens to this movie?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a great version of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou that is set in Depression era Utah. And again, I don't know what happens. There'd be a lot more Mormonism, I can say that for sure. But again, I just kind of go back to this issue where, I remember growing up, again, in this little town that I grew up in, Logan. And like I say, as a kid from the 80s and 90s, I did do normal 80s and 90s kid things, even though I was like a Mormon kid growing up in rural Utah. And we're the butt of jokes and so on, and deservedly so, and kind of like the South, so it was sort of kindred in that way. But I can remember so many encounters. Like there were people in my neighborhood who were like Mormon converts from the old country who still kind of like spoke German and stuff, and who would come over on a boat and so on. And their way of looking at the world was so different from what I saw around me, just in my own life or on TV or in media and so on. And that's, again, kind of what I loved. Now that I think about it, I really love it about being from the West, is there's this kind of sediment of kind of old historical, kind of weird old Utah that every so often you can just see kind of pop up out of nowhere and then return to where it came from. And I just love that about the South too. And I will say that the South, as a Westerner who didn't travel very much, we didn't have, tons of travel money or whatever. The South was always just completely mysterious and exotic and so on. And I still feel that way when I go to the South. When I go to New Orleans, for example, Louisiana, to go do research or go to a conference or whatever, the first thing I do when I get off the plane is panic because the air is so thick. It's as if they're like, I'm from the arid West. And I think like there's either something wrong with this place or something wrong with me, probably both, and I might not make it through. And then I get used to it. And I remember how much I like it and so on and so forth. But it's so exotic and so interesting. And the past is always kind of present in these interesting ways in the South. I do think that's kind of reflected in the movie in a cool way, I think.
I will certainly reckon with you because I had the exact opposite. I used to fly into Denver a lot. And the second I would arrive, like there was a bottle of water just waiting for me in directions saying, chug this right now. You are no longer in the South, because everything just dried out so very fast.
Yeah. And see, for me, that's normal.
Yeah.
Perfectly normal. Whereas, it really is like minimally, at a bare minimum, kind of panic inducing every time I'm on a jetway in the New Orleans airport. I have to remind myself that I'm a human on planet Earth still, and that I'm safe and I'm going to be fine.
Yeah. When I was in Minnesota for graduate school, I would hear locals talk about the difficulties of 70% humidity in the summer. And of course, that was cause for great chuckles for me. But
yeah,
every place has its own unique regional identity. I do like the idea of maybe taking a course calling it Weird Old Utah. I think that might be a lot of fun. I don't know if that's on the BYU course descriptions right now, but someone has got to jump on. Chris Jones maybe would be great to teach that class.
Yeah, he would be fantastic. That would be a team taught class that would take several years to get all the way through. Weird Old Utah is truly weird and in a lot of respects really interesting. I was going to say, the other thing I love about Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, that's a kind of through line in all these Coen Brothers movies, is the fast talking, over vocabularized, but ultimately kind of dumb protagonist character, which I was trying to kind of contemplate why I loved that. I love those characters so much. Walter from Big Lebowski, H.I. McDonough from Raising Arizona. Those are the best characters, right? Again, big vocabulary, not real bright, talk real fast. And I think one of the reasons why I like this movie so much is that that's inherently funny. It's funny to see George Clooney, who to this point was sort of a just pretty boy or whatever.
Yeah.
Just make a fool of himself kind of over and over and over again. So it's really kind of funny. The other reason, though, I think that I'm kind of attracted to it is that as a historian and someone who is sort of engaged in writing and debating people in person and so on, I'm always afraid that that's who I am. That like ultimately I'm like a guy who can sort of talk and so on, and who knows some fancy words, some in another language, but ultimately like isn't actually saying anything. So like it's the character I love to fear in all of the Coen Brothers movies.
I introduce myself that I am just like George Clooney and stop right there and leave out the part that I'm like Clooney in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou. He's phenomenal in this, right? This is the movie where he's playing totally against type. I don't know. Well, we see him maybe in one other role like this, which I think is also another Coen Brothers film with him and Catherine Zeta-Jones.
Oh, Unbearable Cruelty?
Yeah, a bit, where he's not quite, you watch him in the Ocean's films.
Yeah.
It's clear he's got everything figured out. And it's clear in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou that he absolutely has everything figured out as well. Just, he's wrong.
Yes, exactly.
The confidence is absolutely there, right? So I also feel like this is the movie where I forget that I'm watching George Clooney, which I can't always say that I am.
That's true, I think. He is so, look, the reality is he's so astonishingly good looking that it's hard to look at anything else, right? I mean, he's along with Brad Pitt, right? I mean, that you're always looking at Brad Pitt or George Clooney. But he's got like a goofy mustache. He's obsessed with pomade, which is the best like running joke of all time. I mean, Dapper Dan is just amazing. The introduction of his character in the first scene of Oh Brother Where Art Thou is an all timer, right? So you see them in the kind of the musical opening credit scene, which is great, kind of running away from the penal farm and so on. And then they try to get on this train, and I just love it so much. He gets on the train and he says to the hobos on the train, say, "Any you boys smithies," which is like totally what someone would probably say to a bunch of hobos in the Depression who's getting on a train. And then he says, "Or were you otherwise trained in the metallurgic arts before straitened circumstances force you into a life of aimless wandering?" Which is like the most amazing line of all. Like, if I could write something like that, I'd just quit. I'd just retire. And then, of course, because he's not paying attention to his friends who are also trying to get on the train, he gets sucked back out of the train because he's chained to them and he falls and so on. And that to me is like, it sums up everything about the movie, right? It's like liberal do-goodery and kind of big talk and so on winds up getting you kind of chucked out of a moving boxcar.
I won't lie and deny the fact that I refer to myself as the paterfamilias all the time to my children. And yeah, there's that great face he makes right as he's getting pulled off the train.
Yeah.
You know, as great as he is, I don't know that he's my favorite character in the film.
Who's your favorite character?
It's Tim Blake Nelson.
Tim Blake Nelson is one of these people. Like I think of him in this movie, Turturro in this movie, Charles Durning in this movie, the same way I think of like Cate Blanchett or Toni Collette, or like. It must be really, really fun to be as good at something as Tim Blake Nelson is at acting. That must be a really good feeling.
Kills it in every line. There's a line that he makes in this. There's a line he says that I've seen this film no shortage of dozens of times. But when they're driving and he's got the frog in his hand and he's like, Clooney's saying, "I don't think that that's him." And he's like, "Of course it is. Just look at him." I die every single time. The line delivery it's just perfect.
Yeah, he is just amazing. And just props to, I gotta say, Charles Durning, who is the, Pappy O'Daniel, the governor in this movie. Just incredible. Like, that must have been so much fun for him to play this kind of mean-spirited, cutthroat, abusive, husky Southern governor in the Depression. And he just kind of crushes it in every scene too.
Him and the fact that he's got this retinue of yes men around him that are, as they're going on mass communicating.
Right.
There's not a role in here that isn't just delicious to watch, right?
Yeah.
And of course, I feel like we're talking about Coens. We have to talk about John Goodman because he shows up again, steals every scene. Maybe if there's anybody who's going for it even more than Clooney, it's maybe Goodman in this, but he's Cyclops.
Yeah. Cyclops as Bible salesman is, of course, a total stroke of genius, and he's amazing. So I wonder if you so I rewatched this movie, obviously, to do the podcast, and I love the Coen Brothers, and there's kind of levels of Coen Brothers movies from like bleak to silly.
Mm-hmm.
No Country for Old Men being the top of the bleak list, I would imagine. And then like, I've always thought, look, Big Lebowski and Raising Arizona and Oh Brother Where Art Thou are like down in the silly, which is all great. And I gotta say, it was a little more melancholy to rewatch for the first time in a little while, in part because of the themes about political populism and race that I think, when I saw it for the first time back in not 2000 or whenever it came out, I just didn't register in the same way because the culture was quite different. But, I confess that like seeing Papio Daniel and so forth, and the Homer Stokes, who is the kind of populist, anti-corruption, drain the swamp candidate in Louisiana politics, kind of pull this populist maneuver and so forth. It does kind of hit different now, for me anyway, than it did, I think, when I was watching it initially when I was, younger in the first decade of the 21st century.
It really does. For a few different reasons. The reason why, as I started doing this HATM thing years ago, this was just a way, literally the first night I thought it was like, oh, hey, historians, we think all the time. Let's watch National Treasure, and then we can take a night off of thinking. And then 4 movies in, I'm like, we're dissecting Trading Places going, oh, wait, this is actually a history movie, it turns out. And I think in a lot of ways that, part of the reason why I enjoy doing this so much is because I could take a film like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, that I've always loved, and we have to talk about the music in a moment, and go back and say, wait a second, these guys have very cleverly interjected some really heady stuff into this that maybe I wasn't thinking about. I'm 2 years younger than you as a 23-year-old kid in 2000,
Yeah.
and watching it now, especially in our current political climate, saying, whoa, look how this is being amplified. Look how this is being played out.
Yeah. I was thinking too, when I was rewatching it, as I was getting ready to rewatch it, I was like, I wonder what that KKK scene is going to look like.
Yeah.
And, I don't know. I came away thinking that it's still great. And one of the reasons I think it is, I was kind of comparing it to other KKK scenes. Like, remember in Fletch Lives?
Oh, yeah.
There's a kind of scene where the KKK turns out to be bumbling yahoos and whatever. And then there's a scene in Django Unchained.
That's the one I'm thinking of.
Right? That's the one I was thinking of. And one of the things I really like about this, and it sort of demonstrates, I guess, why the Coen Brothers are the Coen Brothers, is that the KKK scene in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is both funny. They're taking the Mel Brooks approach, right? Like, we got to make these people who are our enemies look buffoonish in some way. But it's also scary. Like, that's a legitimately scary scene. When the Grand Wizard of the KKK begins singing "Oh Death," it's really affecting. So I came away thinking, I went into it thinking, I don't know if this is going to quite play the same way. And I came out of it thinking, actually, it's sort of a prescient KKK scene in some respects.
Yeah, it really is. And again, this speaks, I think, to the mastery of what the Coens are able to do to take this movie, which is one of, in my mind, the funniest things I've ever seen. It's really, for me, an enjoyable film. It's not nonstop laughs, but it sets things up so well. And then you're absolutely right. The way that, talk about, look, there's these large gatherings of people who are buying in on this racial identity, and fully committed to white supremacy. Yeah. And it is terrifying when you go back and think about it. And as we're talking about this, though, I'm starting to think about other films that I've seen, at least other mass films that I've seen that have really taken on the KKK in a more direct fashion. The only thing I'm thinking about, maybe American History X, but that's not necessarily KKK. It's skinheads and other white supremacists. But I can't really think of anyone who's really addressed them other than, say, Django Unchained. Right. Through these, maybe it's through humor that we can address these stories.
Yeah, there's part of me that buys into, and I think Mel Brooks had said this at some point. Like, look, Hitler is my worst enemy. I'm Jewish, right? So,
right.
What is my weapon? My weapon is to make him and his people look like fools, and so that's what I'm going to do. So I can go a long ways down that road, right? Like, I think I understand that. It's true, though, as I kind of am thinking about, for example, the KKK scenes in Fletch Lives or Django Unchained or whatever, which are sort of slapsticky, right? They turn the KKK into this group of bumbling buffoons. That feels off to me now in a weird way, because we've seen, in the last several years, a kind of resurgence of that version of integral racism and so forth expressed in communities and groups that are online and that gather in reality. And so I liked the that the Coen Brothers, do they want to make him look kind of dumb and silly? Sure, they have him like doing an odd chant and dances and so on and so forth. But the kind of the terror that they caused in people, you can still kind of sense in their depiction, right? Think of how frightened Tommy Johnson is. Think of how scary the Grand Wizard is when he starts, singing. It really is this kind of intimidating, fearsome moment. So in some respects, it was sort of this, I went into it thinking, oh, maybe I'm not going to like this seeing it now, but I kind of did at the end. It captured it for me.
Yeah. It's those, of course, there's been a huge discussion of memory as well. And, I talk about this a lot, about how there's still a statue of Robert E. Lee on my courthouse square in Murray, Kentucky, where I grew up. It's in Western Kentucky, small little town, 15,000 people. Still there, erected in the early 1920s by the Daughters of the Confederacy, if I recall correctly. And then I was just in northern Alabama, and there are other statues just like it. Those things still exist. And I remember as a kid growing up, sundown towns were still like places I heard about. It's like, oh, there's this town in Western Tennessee you just don't go to. Me? No, you're fine. Other folks don't go there. Why? That was still a thing. I guess it probably still is in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's, and I'm thinking of Dave Chappelle does this, right? I mean, because he has these famous, skits making fun of the Klan and so forth. So I think you're it's a really effective way to push back at this incredibly hate-filled ideology.
Yeah. I mean, I was really kind of lucky growing up where I did and with the parents I had. My parents were wonderful people, not academics at all. And they grew up in this town called Ogden, Utah, which...
Weber State, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Because there's an Air Force base there and it's a railroad junction. For those two reasons, it's the only place really in Utah up until the 90s, maybe later, that had a relatively substantial African-American population. And so when I was growing up, again, in the 80s and 90s, I always knew that my dad had played high school football with his black teammates, and they were his buddies, and they played football together and whatever. And that my mom and dad had gone to high school with African-American kids, and that my mom thought Leon Jones was super hot in high school and so on, right? So I kind of grew up with that. And it was sort of like a little shocking for me, I guess, just based on the way my parents kind of dealt with this stuff, which again was not especially political or anything, just based on their own experience. It was kind of a shock to me to sort of discover racial history in that way. It wasn't part of my familial experience. And in fact, my familial experience was quite the opposite in a lot of respects. So watching that or learning of that history, like seeing it kind of unfold as I became a historian and so on, it's been this process of really disillusionment and so forth on the basis of what I had been taught as a kid, kind of interestingly. So, obviously the West is really, really different than the South in that regard. And I do think, like you say, that this depiction in a lot of respects really does work in some crucial ways that maybe other ways of dealing with the KKK groups like that don't.
I'm kind of wondering, we're talking about these differences between, say, the South and the West. And we talked a little bit earlier about, like, you take this movie and you set it out West, what changes? And I'm thinking maybe music. Can we talk a little bit about, like, because when this movie comes out, it seems like there was this explosion of bluegrass and gospel and Southern hymns this was a massively selling soundtrack at the time. In fact, I tweeted the other day that, to ask people like what their favorite soundtracks were of all time. And this was part of the conversation. It's obviously singles, but, what do you think about the music when you watch this film?
Well, the music is incredible. And one of the things that I again, poked around a little bit, reading and so on in preparation for this. And one of the things that popped up a couple of times in discussions of the soundtrack and so on is that a lot of the songs that are being sung in the actual film itself, so like when the Soggy Bottom Boys sing, Man of Constant Sorrow, or Keep on the Sunny Side. And there's a couple of other ones. Those are actually old songs. Those are songs from like the 1890s. And so they're songs that, in the same way that me and you probably know a bunch of songs from the 60s at random, they're songs in a funny way that people in Depression era, the Depression era South, would have known kind of multi-generationally. And so again, I think it's another, and who knows, like, I don't know what the Coen Brothers process or T-Bone Burnett's process was in kind of curating the soundtrack necessarily, but it's yet another example of them using the kind of the historical layers that make up the Depression South and kind of tapping into the deeper layers at some points, just to kind of get a sense of that like long-term, deep structural history that's kind of coming out in, you know, music and culture and politics that get portrayed in the film.
Do you have a favorite song from the soundtrack?
I actually really love, so at the end of the film, you know, the Soggy Bottom Boys play at this political, you know, gathering and so forth. Kind of famously, they do Man of Constant Sorrow. There's a song right before that Tim Blake Nelson sings about gambling that I just think is amazing. Like
In the Jailhouse Now, is that it?
Yeah, In the Jailhouse Now is an incredible song, and it kind of sums up to me like the kind of mentality that I imagine the Depression era South would have sort of inculcated in people. Like, boy, what's the point in, you know, attempting to do things the right way and so forth, right? But life is one continual round of disappointment and being caught doing bad things and so on anyway. So why not kind of enjoy doing it? And so this kind of like sing-songy account of this guy getting chucked in jail, I think is just really beautiful. And Tim Blake Nelson is just like, he's so amazing to watch doing it.
You know, I enjoy the fact that like there was this revival. And I think I wonder if, say, you take the roles of modern performers, people like Chris Stapleton, who is roughly our age. I think he's a couple of years younger than me, where he is and where this current music scene is now without this film kind of providing maybe a current foundation for an appreciation for Southern Mountain music.
Yeah, and it was such a good corrective. I'm not really a country music kind of guy. I grew up in a country music place, and so had to rebel against that, you know.
Absolutely.
So I'm not really a country music person or whatever, but it was such a nice reaction against the sort of like the Garth Brooks, you know, multiverse or whatever was happening in the
next guy in a big black hat kind of a thing.
Yeah, like that's kind of like all you had was ostensible cowboys singing these kind of, I don't know, goofy pop songs, basically. So this was a fun, you know, corrective. I love listening to Big Rock County Mountain now, though, because for me, that's an early modern song, right? That's about the land of cocaine, you know, where anything goes and like everything is going to be okay. And what I love about that song is that it reflects this ethos that it's like heaven is not where you have a giant mansion and get to do whatever you want, and it's where like the jails are made of tin and you can just walk out when they put you in. And like it's a version of real kind of itinerant life in the Depression, but just a really nice one. And I love that kind of moderated expectations version of what, you know, utopia is.
Speaking of favorites, we kind of talked a little bit about like what we were going to rank here, because we try to do some kind of thoughts on this. And you had suggested favorite Coen films.
I mean, I know it was my idea, and like most of my ideas, it's like not a good one.
That makes you the perfect guest for this, by the way.
Yeah, like how are we going to do this? It's just so, you know, difficult. So I guess I would say that my very favorite Coen Brothers movie, and I think my favorite movie, is the film A Serious Man. And I don't know if you've seen A Serious Man. It's a kind of, I think, a sort of lesser regarded Coen Brothers movie. But it's a kind of, like it's a methodological successor to Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, in that it's telling of Job, but via a Jewish physics professor at the University of Minnesota in the late 1960s. And
clearly,
well, obviously, it would be weird if it wasn't. And I think it's the Coen Brothers' most perfect film.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. Give me three more. Because there's a pretty deep
I know
collection of films at this point in time. And inevitably, what I'm trying to do is get you to leave one off so that someone will be offended by this.
Yeah. And I'm just going to out myself as like really lowbrow because I'm not going to say Oh Country or No Country for Old Men because it's too scary.
It is terrifying.
Yeah.
Can we at least talk about the coin flip scene then real fast?
I've never been more uncomfortable watching a like feature film scene than I was watching that.
Absolutely terrifying.
I would have like hidden my eyes in someone's shoulder if that person would have been around. I was so nervous and uncomfortable during that scene.
Why do you think that scene works so well?
I guess it worked. So Javier Bardem is scary to look at, in part because of the haircut, in part because he has like a giant head, and it's just really very intimidating looking, and in part because legitimately, I mean, this is, I guess, the genius of the Coen Brothers. Legitimately, you don't know what's going to happen.
I think that's a kicker, right? They cast him opposite an unknown actor, a guy whose name Ike. But the casting is perfect. The man behind the register is just... It is. Frankly, he's going toe-to-toe with Javier Bardem there. I mean, as an actor, those guys are having a scene.
Yeah, but it's just nightmare fuel. And it's actually a fun callback to... there's a Funhouse Mirror version of that in Raising Arizona. Oh, yeah. Where they go try to buy balloons from the old guy at the store, and he says these blow up into funny shapes. And if round is funny... So there's like this kind of Funhouse Mirror version of that in their old, but Bardem is the most intimidating screen presence I can imagine ever having seen in that one scene.
I seem to remember reading in a couple different situations where people have said that psychologists have like used him as an example, his performance on film as what, a complete pathological, just no empathy, just sociopath. That's the word I'm looking for.
And what I like is that there's multiple times that happens in that movie, but it's a case of when for the clerk in the store, social convention it doesn't allow him to like run away in terror. It isn't done because it isn't done, and so he has to kind of stand there and watch this play out, which happens more than once.
You're trapped in there with him.
Yeah, right. And you could run screaming, I suppose, but again, the power of your employment and kind of social convention and culture and so on keeps you in this horrifying situation. Right?
Yeah. So, well, moving on to happier films.
Yeah. Okay. So I think number one is Serious Man, which is just an amazing film. I have to do Raising Arizona as number two. There's no way not to. I would lose my Westerner card if I didn't do the one that takes place in kind of arid Arizona and so on. H.I. McDonough, like Nicolas Cage, that's the apex of everything for him. I don't care what anybody says.
Listen, I owe an entire career to Nicolas Cage at this point in time from this National Treasure HATM thing. So, yeah.
But, I mean...
Is Arizona the West, though? Can folks out in Utah look down at Arizona and say, you guys are the West?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to say we're cool with Arizona, but because they're stealing everybody's water. But yeah, definitely Arizona is the West.
I'd always seen them as the Mississippi of the West.
Yeah. Yeah, very true, actually, in a lot of respects, going back to the 1990s and so on. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That'll get me in some trouble.
Yeah, right. Sorry, everybody. 1,000 apologies to Arizona.
No way. I'm not backing down.
But yeah, Arizona, the vistas, the Grand Canyon, to me, it says the arid West for sure. And I just love that. It's such an amazing, weird movie. So definitely, I think Raising Arizona has to be top three, and then Big Lebowski.
Really? You're going to put all of those above Oh Brother?
I think so.
What about Big Lebowski? What makes you love it?
It's so many things. Great soundtrack for one thing. Jeff Bridges as the dude, again, it's this sort of thing I have with the fast talking, over vocabularized characters and so on, where I love them and I fear that I am them. I think I do the same thing kind of with the dude. He's so absurd and such a character and so on. And like the dude is like if I were allowed just to be my worst self, I would probably do that. Something like the dude, only sort of a ski bum rather than whatever kind of bum he is. So, I just think that's an amazing kind of, portrayal of and send up of the aging hippie that I thought was really pretty beautiful.
I'm kind of wondering if maybe some of these Coen Brother films, part of the reason why we love them so much is because they're able to get the lead to do a role that we don't ever see the lead do again. I don't think of Jeff Bridges as the dude. I mean, I know a lot of people do in popular culture, but I grew my first exposure to Jeff Bridges was in Starman, which is a movie I love.
Oh, Starman's a great movie.
So good, right? And have you seen him in what's the film he did with Chris Pine?
Yes.
Hell or High Water.
Hell or High Water. Incredible.
Talk about a great scene.
Like a tremendously gifted guy. That's Starman. That's so funny you mentioned Starman. He sort of behaves like, it's almost like he's a bird. Mm-hmm. Almost. It's kind of bird-like characteristic. It's really incredible. But yeah, he's like a number one actor. I mean, as skilled as anybody. But like, I'm sorry, I look at him now.
Well, the pop culture and memes and GIFs themselves, I mean, just that movie was meant for them. It's another film.
Not a beloved movie when it came out. I mean, it sort of did. It was the follow-up, I'm pretty sure, to Fargo. That's where it comes in the order of operations for the Coen Brothers. And I think, on the heels of the success of Fargo, another incredible movie. But why are we making this list? This was a stupid idea. Delete everything.
We'll be here for 6 more hours. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think people were really confused about why they had made this kind of.
What does this movie do?
Dumb movie about this bozo, like kind of faux noir bozo in Los Angeles, and it's only until like college kids basically started watching it over and over again in the 2000s and so on that it became, the Big Lebowski.
Amazing that as big or as great as Oh Brother Where Art Thou are, we could sit here and say, yeah, that's good, but like the people who made this made 7 other films that you like more.
I'm telling you, it is unbelievable, their body of work. By the way, Big Lebowski, Philip Seymour Hoffman, just killing it in that movie. Just so good.
Can I tell you my low-key favorite Philip Seymour Hoffman role?
Yeah.
Mission Impossible 3.
Oh. I mean, over Twister?
Yeah. I think he's easily, in my mind, the best villain in Mission Impossible. And of course, I was saying this the other day. You see Philip Seymour Hoffman on screen. I don't care what movie you're watching. You're watching Boogie Nights. You're watching Twister. You're watching whatever. You're in for a role.
He's what's up. Yeah.
Oh, arguably the best actor of his generation. Just anytime he showed up, you knew there was going to be this scene chewing whatever it was. But
yeah. Unbelievable. Although, I teach a course at BYU and have for a long time on the age of the French Revolution. And one of the books that I have my students read is this great book called When the King Took Flight. And it's about Louis XVI attempts to escape from his kind of confinement in the Louvre Palace and flee to the German border in summer of 1791. He's caught through a series of coincidences, basically, out in eastern France, and then brought back to ultimately be imprisoned in the Temple prison and stand trial and so on. And great book. Artistry, research, you name it. Tackett really did a number on that book. And with my students, after we read the book, I always play a rousing game of cast the movie. Like, okay, we have all of these incredible characters and so on. Who's going to play them? And Philip Seymour Hoffman as Louis XVI is just such a go-to. I mean, he could do anything. So I just have, Gone Too Soon, incredible performances all the time. Just amazing.
All right, let's bring this back.
Okay.
Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Is it a history movie?
Yes, I think so. So on the one hand, when I rewatched it, one of the things that kind of jumped out at me is that, again, it comes out right around the year 2000, and it's sort of about a version of the Depression-era South that is, as George Clooney keeps saying, the South is going to change, right? There's all these kind of technological innovations that they keep hinting at. They're going to dam the valley. Pappy O'Daniel he's mass politicking. He's using the radio and so on. And these technological transformations are kind of confronting this old, weird version of the South. And one of the reasons I think it's a history movie is because that's what's happening in 1999, 2000, 2001, right? There is this technological revolution that's happening that is clearly transforming things in ways that could result in an age of reason like the one they had in France, or like actually happened, it could be a hellscape and so on. Right? But so I think it's a history movie in a funny way, in that if I had to guess, the Coen brothers are registering that set of transformations that are actually happening in the world of the late 20th century. And they're kind of thinking through what that would look like in the Depression era South. That's why the radio, the dams, so on and so forth, right? So I think it's a history movie in that way. It's people it's people using one of my colleagues calls it your history muscle, right? So you flex your mind and you kind of flatten the distance between you and your historical subjects, and you start thinking in terms of similarities and analogies and so on. And I kind of see the Coen brothers doing that. And the other I think it's a history movie because it's an affecting portrayal of two things. One, the Depression. Like, if I think of the Depression at this point, if I wind up having to teach that in any of my classes and so on, this is what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the sepia-toned,
horse
landscape.
eating.
Yeah, right. Yeah, horse eating. Yeah, slaughtered this horse last Tuesday. Like, I'm thinking about that landscape, right? The kind of ecological disaster, the kind of the confusion, the fear, people turning and being collaborators with power in ways that make them uncomfortable and so on. That's exactly what I'm thinking of. So I think it's not, who cares if it's accurate? That's not what we're here for. But it's this just powerful depiction that does encompass some real truths about that period. And the other reason I think it's a history movie is because it's an iteration of one of the great primary sources we have. That's Homer's Odyssey. And the Coen brothers are doing history things, right? They're they're choosing which bits of evidence, which bits of narrative they want to play with, right? So they're doing history stuff. So I just think it's kind of catnip for people like us.
Oh, catnip for people like, God, that's such a great line. That's perfect. All right, so you have now completed your first Historians of the Movies podcast. What's next for you? You're working on this thing with Brett.
Yeah. So Brett and I. By the way, I'm going to reveal this will be an exclusive for the podcast.
Oh, absolutely, go for it.
Speaking of kind of deep structure and old weird Utah and all that other stuff. My mom and dad they still live up in Logan, Utah, up north, and I was up there a few years ago, and they had. They'd gotten in the mail. There's some distant relative of mine who produces a genealogy newsletter every once in a while, the Hodson Herald. And you can subscribe, I'm sure, somewhere. But in any case, they'd just gotten it in the mail, and my dad had kind of thrown it on the counter and stuff. And I happened to be looking at it, and it's just like a sheet of paper. And they had reprinted a kind of autobiographical account that my great-grandmother, whose name is Clara May Love, great name, had written about growing up in Kaysville, Utah in the 1880s. So I, of course, started reading this. It was cool, And she's going along and she's describing her childhood. And then she says, I used to go into the orchards with my best friend, Manuel Rushforth. And we used to throw rotten fruit at the older kids, and we got in a lot of trouble. And so the first thing I did, of course, was text Brett and say, do you have an ancestor named Manuel Rushforth? And it turns out it's his great aunt or something like that. So this is my it's my advertisement for deep structure. There are things pulling everything through. So in any case, after my great grandma and Brett's great aunt got done throwing stuff at the other kids in Kaysville. So he and I have just completed a book manuscript that is this kind of big history of France and Africa and the Americas from the age of the Crusades through the Napoleonic period. And we just completed it. It's making its way, fingers crossed, through the bowels of the press right now. and hopefully will be coming out relatively soon. It's been way too long in coming. We've taken way too long to do it, but it's been really fun to do. And he's a great partner to work with and write with.
And he's one of my favorite people. So I can't wait to see it. Chris Hodson, thank you so much for being here today, man.
Thank you, Jason. I really appreciate it.
And that's a wrap here at Historians and Movies Podcast. Thank you so much to our guest, Christopher Hodson, today for jumping in to talk to us about Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Chris, I loved that conversation. I hope you come back many, many times to be on this podcast because that was awesome. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. If you want to learn more about HATM, you can find us on Twitter at #HATM or follow me at Herbert History. And guys, thank you so much every single week for joining in, being part of this, listening in. We couldn't do this without you, so continue to spread the good word. And we will look forward to talking to you sooner or later, eventually, again. Guys, just thanks for being here. We'll talk to you later. Bye.